The radio said the gates would be open. The radio said hot food, clean water, medical triage, and a cot with a blanket. The radio repeated the coordinates every 20 minutes on a loop in the same woman's voice, with the same small breath she took before the word survivors. I drove for 2 days and most of a third toward that voice. When I got there, the gates were open exactly the way she'd promised. That was the first thing that was wrong, and I didn't understand why until much later. I should explain who I am, because the kind of person I am is the reason I am still alive, and also the reason I made the mistake I made. My name doesn't matter for this. What matters is that I spent 11 years as a logistics coordinator for a regional hospital network in the upper Midwest. My job, simplified, was to make sure that when a truck of insulin left a warehouse in one city, it arrived at a pharmacy in another city before a diabetic child ran out. I was good at it. I was good at it because I understood that systems don't lie, but they do omit. A shipment manifest tells you what's in the truck. It doesn't tell you whether the driver slept. A temperature log tells you the cooler held at 36 degrees. It doesn't tell you whether someone propped the door open for a smoke break at 3 in the morning. The job, really, was learning to read the silences. When the outbreak started, and I'm not going to spend time on what it was, because by day 3 nobody knew, and by day 5 it didn't matter. I was in a motel outside Duluth on a site visit. I had a half tank of gas, 2 bottles of water, a laptop bag, and the suit I'd worn to the meeting. I had no family to drive home to. My sister lived in Oregon, and we hadn't spoken in 3 years over something so small I genuinely cannot remember what it was. My parents were both gone. I had a cat named Ostrava who was being fed by a neighbor I trusted, and on the second night I made peace with the fact that Ostrava was probably going to outlive me, because cats are self-sufficient and I was not. The radio broadcast started on the morning of day 2. I was in the motel parking lot trying to decide whether to drive south or west. South meant cities, and I had already seen enough on the news to know cities were finished. West meant Canada eventually, but also meant crossing terrain I didn't know in a sedan that wasn't built for it. The broadcast made the decision for me. A woman's voice, professionally calm, reading from what sounded like a prepared sheet. Civilian shelter, federally administered, located at, and then a string of coordinates that I wrote on the back of a gas station receipt with a pen I had to shake to get working. The site was in northern Minnesota, almost to the border, in an area I vaguely remembered as either a National Guard training facility or a decommissioned radar station. I couldn't recall which. The broadcast said the gates would open at noon on day 3 and remain open. It said to bring identification. It said not to bring weapons. It said to come alone or with immediate family only. It said the perimeter was secured. The word secured is the one I want you to remember. I will come back to it. I drove carefully, which is to say, I drove the way a logistics person drives, which is to say I planned. I had 3/4 of a tank when I left the motel. I siphoned from an abandoned pickup outside a town called Cloquet, using a length of garden hose I cut from a yard, and I want to be honest here, I felt sick about it. Not because of the gasoline, but because I had to step over a body to get to the truck, and the body was a man about my age who had clearly been trying to do the same thing I was now doing. He had a hose, he had a red plastic can, he had not made it to a second vehicle. I didn't look at his face. I told myself I was being practical. I told myself a lot of things on that drive. The roads got worse the further north I went, but in an unexpected way. Not blocked, not crowded, just empty. By the second afternoon I had not seen another moving vehicle for over 4 hours. I saw cars in ditches. I saw one school bus on its side in a field with the emergency exit propped open from the inside, and I did not stop to look. I saw a dog, alone, trotting along the shoulder with purpose, going somewhere it had decided to go. I remember thinking that the dog looked more competent than I felt. The radio kept broadcasting. Every 20 minutes, the same loop, the same woman, the same small breath. I started timing it against my odometer. The signal got stronger as I drove north, which made sense. By the time I was within 60 miles of the coordinates, the signal was clean enough that I could hear a faint hum behind her voice, like a refrigerator running in the next room. I noted the hum. I didn't think about it. I should have thought about it. I arrived at the access road on the afternoon of day 5. The sun was low and the light was the color of weak tea. The access road was paved for the first half-mile and then turned to graded gravel. There was a sign at the turnoff that said restricted or U.S. government property, and underneath it, taped over the original text, a piece of white printer paper laminated in plastic that read civilian shelter. Proceed to main gate. Have identification ready. The printer paper was clean. No dirt, no rain damage, no curling at the edges. It looked like it had been put up that morning. That was the second thing that was wrong, and again I noted it without understanding it. I drove the gravel road slowly. Trees on both sides, then a clearing, then a chain-link fence topped with concertina wire, and a guard booth at the gate. The gate was open. Not propped open, not broken. Open, retracted on its track, the way it would be if a guard had pulled it back to wave a vehicle through and then walked away. The guard booth was empty. The light inside the booth was on. I stopped my car about 30 yards out and sat there with the engine running for almost 10 minutes. I did this because the logistics part of my brain was telling me something was off, and I wanted to figure out what before I committed. The fence was intact, the booth was lit, the gate was open. There was a clipboard on the small shelf inside the booth. I could see it through the window. There were no vehicles in the visible part of the compound, but the road curved past a low building and I couldn't see beyond. I could not hear anything. No generators, no voices, no movement. The radio in my car was still broadcasting the loop. The perimeter is secured. Please proceed to the main gate. Have identification ready. Here is what I thought, and I want to be precise about it because this is where the mistake began. I thought the broadcast is automated. It's been running on a loop for at least 3 days. The fact that it's still running means the power is still on. The fact that the booth light is on confirms power. The fact that the gate is open and the booth is empty suggests that personnel were here recently and stepped away, perhaps to deal with an internal matter, perhaps to receive other arrivals further inside the compound. The clean sign at the turnoff suggests recent human activity. The intact fence suggests the compound has not been overrun. The most likely explanation, weighing all of this, is that the shelter is operational but understaffed, and I am being asked to proceed under my own initiative because there is no one available to escort me at this moment. That was a reasonable read of the evidence. I want you to understand that. A reasonable person, looking at what I was looking at, would have concluded what I concluded. The error was not in the conclusion. The error was in the question I was asking. I was asking what is the most likely explanation for what I see. I should have been asking what is the worst explanation for what I see and can I rule it out. I drove through the gate. The road curved around the low building, which turned out to be a vehicle bay with 3 open doors. 2 Humvees were parked inside, and a civilian pickup and what I think was a fuel truck. None of them had anyone in them. The keys were in the ignition of the closest Humvee. I noted this because the logistics part of my brain noted everything, and I kept driving. Past the vehicle bay there was a parade ground, or something like one of a flat rectangle of asphalt with painted lines, big enough for maybe 200 people to stand in formation. There was no one on it. Beyond the parade ground there was a cluster of buildings, single-story, painted the same flat tan as every military structure I had ever seen. There were lights on in several of them. I could see the lights through the windows. I drove toward the largest building, which had a hand-painted sign on a sandwich board out front that read "Intake. Please wait to be greeted." I parked. I got out of my car. I left the keys in the ignition because that was a habit I developed in the last 3 days, and I want to remember that I did this because it later mattered. The air was very still. There was a smell I couldn't place at first, faint but persistent, something between burnt coffee and chemical sweetness. I remember thinking it smelled like a hospital cafeteria. Then I thought, no, it smells like the loading dock of a hospital cafeteria where the dumpsters are. Then I stopped thinking about the smell because I needed to focus on the building. I walked up to the door. There was a sign-in sheet on a folding table by the entrance with a pen on a string. The sheet had a printed grid: name, time of arrival, point of origin, number and party, identification verified. There were entries on the sheet, 23 of them. The earliest was from day 3 at 12:47 p.m. The latest was from day 4 at 9:15 p.m. After that, nothing. The pen still worked. I tested it on the corner of the page. I want to walk you through what I noticed about the sign-in sheet, because every detail of it should have told me what had happened, and I read every detail and still didn't understand. The handwriting on the entries varied. Different people, different pens, different pressures. The early entries were neat. The later entries were less neat. The very last entry, from 9:15 p.m. on day 4, was almost illegible, and the line for identification verified had a check mark that trailed off the page, as if the person making it had been distracted or interrupted. The point of origin column showed cities from across the upper Midwest: Minneapolis, Fargo, Thunder Bay, one entry from as far away as Winnipeg. The number in party column showed mostly 1s and 2s, a few 3s, one family of 5. What I concluded from this, sitting at the table with the pen in my hand, was that the shelter had been receiving arrivals steadily for almost 2 days, and that intake had stopped sometime late on day 4 for reasons that were not yet clear. I wrote my own name on the sheet. I wrote my time of arrival, my point of origin, my number and party, and I left the identification verified column blank because there was no one there to verify it. Then I went inside. The intake building was a single large room with a linoleum floor and fluorescent lights that hummed at a frequency I could feel in my teeth. There were folding chairs arranged in rows, maybe 40 of them, facing a counter at the far end. Behind the counter were 3 computer workstations, all powered on, all displaying the same login screen. There was a coffee urn on a side table with a stack of styrofoam cups. The urn was full. I touched it. It was warm but not hot. The kind of warm a coffee urn gets when it's been on a low setting for a long time and nobody has refilled it. There were personal items on some of the chairs: a canvas bag, a child's stuffed rabbit, a man's wool coat folded neatly with a pair of glasses on top, a woman's purse, open, with a wallet inside that I did not touch. The arrangement of the items suggested that people had been sitting in those chairs and had gotten up to do something, to be processed, to be escorted somewhere, and had not come back for their things. I stood in that room for a long time. I'm not sure how long. I know the logistics part of my brain was working through scenarios, because that's what it does, but I was not arriving at any scenario that fit all the evidence. The evidence said people came here, they sat in these chairs, they put down their bags and their coats, and then they went somewhere. The lights are on. The coffee is warm, the pen still works. Whatever happened, happened recently, and it happened to all of them at once, and it happened in a way that did not involve struggle. There was no overturned furniture. There was no blood. There was no broken glass. The stuffed rabbit was sitting upright on the chair the way a child would have set it down before being told to come to the counter. I called out. I said hello, and then I said, "Is anyone here?" And then I said it louder. My voice did not echo the way I expected it to. The room absorbed it. I realized after a moment that the fluorescent hum was masking the silence, making the room feel less empty than it was. I turned the lights off, using a switch by the door, and the silence that came in behind the dying hum was the deepest silence I have ever stood inside. I turned the lights back on. I left the intake building and walked across the parade ground toward the next cluster of buildings. I was looking for people. I realize now, also looking for a story, for some configuration of evidence that would let me explain to myself what I was seeing in a way that did not require me to leave. Because here's the thing I've not told you yet, and which you need to understand. I did not want to leave. I had driven for 2.5 days. I had stepped over a dead man to siphon his gasoline. I had a quarter tank left and no plan beyond this place, and the radio in my car was still broadcasting that the perimeter was secured. The cost of leaving was high. The cost of staying was, at this point, only theoretical. So I kept walking. The next building I entered was a barracks. 2 long rows of bunks, military issue, made up with green wool blankets pulled tight. A few of the bunks had personal items on them, a paperback, a phone charger plugged into nothing, a pair of boots set neatly at the foot of the bed. The barracks were occupied. They were just not currently occupied. I checked the bathroom at the end of the hall. The lights were on. There was a wet handprint on the mirror, low, the size of a child's hand. The water in the sink had been left running at a trickle. I turned it off. I want to describe the next thing I found carefully, because it was the thing that should have made me leave, and it did not. In the bathroom, on the floor next to one of the stalls, there was a hospital wristband, the plastic kind, with a printed name and a barcode. The name on it was a woman's name, and below the name was a date of birth that put her at 61 years old, and below that was a line that read triage, green. I knew what the green designation meant. I had worked in hospital logistics for 11 years. Green meant ambulatory, walking wounded, lowest priority. Green meant this person is fine, treat them last. The wristband had been cut off, not torn off. The plastic clasp was still intact, but the band itself had been severed cleanly, the way a nurse cuts a wristband off a patient who is being discharged or transferred. I stood there holding the wristband and I tried to make it fit. Triage wristbands meant there had been a medical screening. A medical screening meant doctors, nurses, equipment. The shelter had functioning intake. The shelter had been processing people. Some of those people had been deemed green, fine, low priority, and their wristbands had been cut off, presumably because they had been cleared. Cleared to do what? Cleared to go where? The barracks was the obvious answer. They had been cleared, sent to the barracks, and then nothing. And then they had walked out of the barracks, leaving their boots at the foot of their beds, leaving the water running, leaving a handprint on the mirror, and they had not come back. I put the wristband in my pocket. I am not sure why I did this. I think I wanted evidence, although evidence of what, and for whom, I could not have said. I went back outside. The light was lower now, the sun close to the tree line. I had maybe 40 minutes of usable daylight left. I made a decision then that I want to walk you through because it was, in retrospect, the decision that mattered. I decided to check one more building before going back to my car. I told myself I was being thorough. I told myself that if I left without understanding what had happened, I would spend the rest of my life, however long that was, wondering. I told myself that the answer was probably mundane, that there was probably a debriefing happening in some larger central building, that I would walk in on 150 people quietly attending an evening orientation and feel foolish about my fear. That is what I told myself. What was actually happening in my head, I think, was simpler. I had committed. I had driven here. I had signed the sheet. I had a quarter tank of gas. The cost of having been wrong about this place was so high that I needed, at a level below reasoning, for it to not be wrong. So I kept looking for the version of the story in which it wasn't. The building I chose was the largest one in the compound, set back at the rear, with double doors and a loading bay on one side. I thought it might be a mess hall or a command building. It turned out to be a gymnasium. I want to slow down here. The doors were unlocked. I pushed one of them open and the smell I'd noticed earlier, the burnt coffee chemical smell, was much stronger inside. Not overwhelming, not the smell of decay, just present, the way a smell is present in a room where something has been spilled and partly cleaned up. The gymnasium was lit, but only partially. About half the overhead lights were on, the other half off, in a pattern that suggested a power-saving setting rather than a malfunction. The floor of the gymnasium was covered in cots, hundreds of them, arranged in neat grids with narrow aisles between them, the way a field hospital is arranged. The cots were occupied. I stood in the doorway for what felt like a long time but was probably 10 or 15 seconds. The people on the cots were not moving. They were lying on their backs mostly, with blankets pulled up to their chests. Some of them had IV stands next to their cots, with bags hanging from the hooks. The bags were mostly empty. A few still had fluid in them. The lines ran down to the people on the cots. None of the people on the cots were moving. My first thought, and I want to be honest about this, was that they were sleeping. That is a ridiculous thought, I know. But the brain looks for the explanation it can live with. And sleeping was the explanation I could live with for the first several seconds. Then I looked more carefully, and I saw that the man on the nearest cot had his eyes open. Not open in an active way. Open and fixed, his head turned slightly toward the door, as if he had been looking at the door at the moment when he stopped looking at anything. I want to describe what I felt then because I think it matters. I did not panic, I did not run, I did not scream. The logistics part of my brain. The part that had gotten me here, the part that had read the sign-in sheet and the wristband and the warm coffee. Engaged, and it engaged badly. It said, "This is a medical event." These people were triaged, green and yellow and red, and the green ones are in the barracks, and the yellow and red ones are here. And something has gone wrong with the treatment, and the staff have either evacuated or are in another building dealing with the aftermath. It said, "You are looking at a mass casualty event that occurred within the last 12 to 18 hours, based on the temperature of the coffee and the state of the IV bags." It said, "This is bad, but it is explicable, and explicable means survivable." I took a step into the gymnasium. The floor was tacky under my shoe. I looked down. The linoleum was clean. Actively clean, the way a floor looks when it has been mopped recently. But the mop had missed something near the doorway, a thin film of liquid that had dried partly, not blood, something clearer. I looked at my shoe and I looked at the cots and I made the next mistake. I assumed that whatever had killed these people was over. I assumed that because I was standing in the doorway and I was still alive, the threat was no longer active. I assumed, in other words, that the absence of an immediate consequence to my presence meant there was no consequence to my presence. This is the assumption I want you to understand. This is the one that mattered. When you walk into a room full of dead people, and you are not yet dead, your brain tells you that you are safe. Your brain is wrong. Your brain is calculating from a sample size of one observation over a span of seconds, and it is extrapolating that to the entire space and the entire future. It is doing this because the alternative, that you are already in the process of being killed and simply do not know it yet, is not actionable. The brain prefers explanations that allow for action. The brain hates explanations that suggest the decision has already been made. I walked further into the gymnasium. I checked the nearest cot, and then the next, and then the next. The pattern was consistent. The people on the cots were dead. They had died, as far as I could tell, peacefully. There were no signs of struggle, no expressions of pain. Their hands were at their sides or folded on their chests. Their blankets were undisturbed. If I had not seen the open eyes on the first man, I might have walked between the cots for several minutes before realizing. I checked one of the IV bags. The label was printed clearly. It was a saline solution with a sedative additive, in a concentration I recognized as standard for sedation during transport or treatment. Not a lethal dose on its own, but the bags were marked with handwritten notations, initials, times, and a code I didn't recognize. A 3-letter code repeated on every bag I checked. A BX. I assumed at first that this meant antibiotics, which is the standard medical abbreviation. But there was no second bag for the antibiotic. The notation was on the saline bag itself, as if the saline had been the antibiotic, or as if something had been added to the saline that was being recorded under the antibiotic notation. I want to be careful here because I am about to describe a conclusion I drew, and I want you to understand both why I drew it and why it was not the conclusion I should have drawn. I concluded that the staff at the shelter had been treating arrivals for the outbreak, that they had been running IV antibiotics, or something they were calling antibiotics, on the assumption that the pathogen was bacterial or partly bacterial, that something had gone wrong with the treatment. Perhaps the wrong concentration, perhaps a contamination, perhaps the pathogen had not been what they thought it was, and that the people in this gymnasium had died as a result. I concluded, further, that the staff had realized their error and had evacuated, leaving the lights in the broadcast running, perhaps because they were going to come back, perhaps because they had been in too much of a hurry to shut anything down. This was a coherent explanation. It accounted for almost everything I had seen. It accounted for the empty intake area. The staff had stopped processing new arrivals once they realized the treatment was killing people. It accounted for the barracks. The green-tagged civilians had been cleared and sent to the barracks, and then evacuated when the staff realized the situation. It accounted for the warm coffee, the open gate, the running water. It accounted, almost, for everything. What it did not account for was the question of where the green-tagged civilians had gone. The barracks was empty. There were over 100 bunks, and most of them showed signs of having been occupied. If the staff had evacuated and taken the green-tagged civilians with them, that was a convoy of 100 or more people. Where were the vehicles? The vehicle bay had 3 vehicles in it, and they were all still there. The parade ground had no tire tracks beyond the ones I had made coming in. A convoy of that size would have left evidence. I stood in the gymnasium and I worked through this, and I came up with an explanation. I told myself that the green-tagged civilians had been moved on foot, perhaps to a secondary location within the compound that I had not yet discovered. I told myself this even though I knew, at some level, that you do not move 100 panicked civilians on foot through a forest at night without leaving evidence. I told myself this because I needed an explanation that did not include the possibility I had not yet allowed myself to consider. The possibility I had not yet allowed myself to consider was that the green-tagged civilians had not been evacuated, that they had also been treated, that the gymnasium was not the only room like this, that the reason I had not found the staff was because the staff were here too, somewhere among the cots, indistinguishable from the civilians because the treatment had not differentiated. I started checking the cots more carefully. It took me almost 20 minutes, working systematically from the door inward, to find what I was looking for. On a cot near the center of the gymnasium, a woman in her 40s, wearing what had been a white coat under her blanket, with a stethoscope still around her neck. Her name tag was clipped to her coat. It identified her as a major in the Army Medical Corps. There was an IV in her arm. The bag above her was the same as all the other bags. A BX. The handwritten notation was in her own handwriting. I could tell because it matched the handwriting on the cots around her, which had also, I now realized, been recorded in her hand. She had been treating the others, and then she had treated herself. I sat down on the floor next to her cot. I think I sat down because my legs would not hold me. I sat there for what was probably only a minute or two, but it felt much longer, and during that time I worked out what had actually happened. I want to walk you through it, because the working out is the part that matters. The shelter had been set up quickly. That much was obvious from the hand-painted signs and the laminated printer paper at the gate. It had been set up by military medical personnel with limited information about the pathogen. They had been receiving civilian arrivals for 2 days. They had been triaging them. The green ones, ambulatory, no obvious symptoms, had been sent to the barracks. The yellow and red ones, symptomatic, had been brought to the gymnasium for treatment. The treatment was an IV protocol that the major and her team had designed based on their best understanding of the pathogen. They had been wrong about the pathogen. The treatment had been killing the symptomatic patients. But that was not the failure. The failure was something else. At some point, late on day 4, based on the sign-in sheet, the staff had realized that the green-tagged civilians in the barracks were beginning to show symptoms. The pathogen had an incubation period longer than they had assumed. Everyone they had cleared as green was in fact infected. Everyone they had been sending to the barracks was going to be symptomatic within a day. The staff themselves had been exposed repeatedly during intake and triage. They had been wearing protective equipment, but the equipment had been designed for a different category of pathogen, and they had begun to realize this too late. The major had made a decision. I do not know if it was her decision alone or a decision made with others, but I know it was a decision because the evidence of it was all around me. She had decided that the treatment, even though it was killing the symptomatic patients, was a more humane death than what the pathogen would do. She had decided to bring the green-tagged civilians from the barracks to the gymnasium and treat them too. She had decided to treat herself and her staff. The barracks was empty because everyone in it had been brought here. The gymnasium was full because the gymnasium was the end point. I want you to understand that I am not certain about this. I am telling you the explanation I constructed, sitting on the floor of that gymnasium next to the major's body, because it was the explanation that fit the evidence. It is possible there was another explanation. It is possible the major was not making a humane choice, but a panicked one. It is possible the treatment was not killing the patients, but was instead the only thing keeping them comfortable while the pathogen killed them. I am telling you what I concluded. I am not telling you what was true. I have learned not to confuse those things. What I knew for certain, sitting on that floor, was this. Everyone in the compound was dead. Everyone who had been in the compound for more than a few hours had been exposed. The pathogen had a longer incubation period than the original assumptions had accounted for. I had been in the compound for approximately 90 minutes. I had touched a coffee urn, a sign-in pen, a wristband, a doorknob, an IV bag, the floor of the gymnasium. I had breathed the air. I had been exposed. Here is what I did. I want to describe this carefully because it is the part of the story I am least proud of and most unsure about. I stood up. I walked out of the gymnasium. I did not run. I walked across the parade ground to my car. I got in my car. I started the engine. I drove out the open gate and back down the gravel access road and back to the highway. I drove for 45 minutes until I came to a place where the road crossed a small river on a concrete bridge, and I stopped on the bridge. I got out of the car. I took off all my clothes. I left them in a pile on the bridge. I walked, naked, 50 yards down the embankment to the river. and I got into the water. The water was cold enough that it took my breath away. I scrubbed myself with handfuls of sand from the riverbed, in the way I had once read was the correct method for decontaminating from chemical exposure, although I am not sure that was the correct method for what I was doing. I stayed in the water for as long as I could stand it, which was probably 10 minutes. Then I got out, and I walked back up to the bridge, and I opened the trunk of my car, where I had a duffel bag with a change of clothes I had taken from my motel room 3 days earlier. I dressed. I left the original clothes on the bridge. I drove on. I want to be clear about what I was doing, because I was not, at that point, thinking the way the logistics part of my brain had been thinking earlier. The logistics part of my brain had gone quiet. What I was doing was not based on evidence or reasoning. What I was doing was based on the hope that if the pathogen was on my skin, the cold water would carry it away, and if the pathogen was in my lungs, there was nothing I could do, and if the pathogen was in my bloodstream, there was nothing I could do. I was acting on the only variable I could affect, which is what people do when they have run out of other options. I was not certain it would work. I was almost certain it would not work. I did it anyway because the alternative was sitting in the car and waiting to find out, and I was not capable of that. I drove for another 2 hours, until the gas in my tank was low enough that I needed to either find more or stop. I found a small town with a single gas station that had been broken into but not emptied, and I siphoned what I could from the underground tank using a length of rubber hose I found in the station's garage. The town was empty in a way I had not yet seen. Not abandoned in haste, but abandoned thoroughly. Doors locked, windows shuttered, as if the residents had organized an evacuation and left in good order. I do not know where they went. I do not know if they made it. I slept that night in the car, parked behind the gas station with the doors locked and a tire iron on the passenger seat. I did not sleep well. I kept waiting to feel symptoms, to feel feverish, to feel my throat close, to feel whatever the pathogen did when it began to act. I felt nothing. I felt cold and tired and hungry, but those were not symptoms. I told myself those were not symptoms. By morning, I had begun to allow myself to believe that I might have gotten away with it, that my 90 minutes of exposure had not been enough, that the cold water and the sand had done something useful, that I was going to live. I drove on. I am still driving on. That was 11 days ago. I have not developed symptoms. I do not know what this means. I do not know if I was exposed and my immune system handled it, or if I was exposed and the pathogen is incubating in me on a longer timeline than I have so far survived, or if I was somehow not exposed at all, or if the pathogen is no longer transmissible at the surfaces I touched, or if I am one of the people, however many of them there are, who is naturally resistant. I do not know. The radio broadcast from the shelter stopped sometime on the 8th day, which is to say the 3rd day after I left. I assume the power finally failed. I have not heard another broadcast since. I have thought a great deal about what I did wrong. I want to tell you what I have concluded because I think it might be useful to someone, and because the act of saying it might be useful to me. I trusted a system that I did not build and could not verify. That is not, by itself, the mistake. Everyone trusts systems they did not build. You trust the people who treat the water you drink, and the people who inspect the bridges you drive over, and the people who package the food you eat. You have to. The mistake was not in trusting the system. The mistake was in failing to ask what the system's assumptions were, and whether those assumptions still held. The shelter was built on assumptions. The assumption that the pathogen had a short incubation period, so that people who were asymptomatic at intake could be safely housed with each other. The assumption that the staff's protective equipment was adequate, so that intake workers could process arrivals without becoming vectors themselves. The assumption that the treatment protocol, designed in the first chaotic hours of the outbreak, was correct. Each of these assumptions was reasonable when it was made. Each of them was made by competent people doing their best with the information they had. And each of them was wrong, in a way that was not visible from inside the system, because the system's success in its first 2 days seemed to confirm the assumptions. The barracks filled up. Intake processed people smoothly. Triage worked. The system was functioning. The system was, in fact, killing everyone in it on a timeline that the system was not equipped to detect. When I drove up to that gate, I was not evaluating the assumptions the shelter had been built on. I was evaluating the surface evidence. The lit booth, the open gate, the running broadcast, and I was concluding from that surface evidence that the shelter was operational. The shelter was, in a sense, operational. The lights were on. The gate was open. The broadcast was running. The system was doing exactly what it had been designed to do. The problem was that the system had been designed to do something that, given the actual nature of the pathogen, was no longer survivable for anyone who entered it. I have thought about whether I would have made a different decision if I'd known what the assumptions were. I think I would have. I think if the broadcast had said we believe the pathogen has a short incubation period and our protective equipment is rated for Category B exposure, I would have known to be more cautious. I would have known what to test against. The broadcast did not say any of that. The broadcast said the perimeter is secured. And I trusted the word secured to mean something specific. And the people who wrote the broadcast trusted the word to mean something specific. And we trusted the same word to mean two different things, and the gap between those two meanings was the gap I drove into. There is a part of me that wants to be angry at the staff at the shelter. There is a part of me that wants to say they should have updated the broadcast when they realized the situation was failing. They should have changed the loop to say, "Do not approach." They should have shut the gate. They should have done something to prevent the next person, me, from driving in. But I have thought about this carefully, and I do not think I have the right to that anger. By the time the staff realized the system was failing, they were already, themselves, infected. They were already making the decisions that ended in the gymnasium. They were not in a position to update broadcasts or close gates. They were in a position to make a single final decision about how the people in their care would die, and they made it. And I do not know if it was the right decision, but I know it was a decision made by people who were, by then, beyond saving themselves. I am not going to be angry at them. I am going to be honest about the fact that the system they built failed, and the honesty does not require anger. What I will say instead is this. If you are listening to this, and you are still alive, and you are considering driving toward a place that has been broadcasting the words "the perimeter is secured," I want you to think about what those words actually mean. They mean that at some point in the past, someone evaluated the perimeter and judged it secure based on a set of criteria. Those criteria were specific. They covered some threats and not others. The word "secured" is a summary of a judgment, not a description of reality. A perimeter can be secured against the wrong threat. A perimeter can be secured at the moment of judgment and unsecured 5 hours later. A perimeter that is broadcast as secured for 3 days has been broadcast based on a judgment made 3 days ago by people who may no longer be alive to update the judgment. Do not drive toward broadcasts. If you must drive toward a place you can verify with your own eyes from a distance before you commit. Stop a mile out. Watch through binoculars if you have them. Watch for movement. Watch for the kinds of activity that a functioning shelter would produce. People walking between buildings, vehicles arriving and leaving, smoke from chimneys or generator exhaust. Do not accept the absence of evidence as evidence of normality. The absence of evidence in this kind of situation is almost always evidence of something very bad that has not yet been reported. I have one more thing to say, and then I am going to stop, because I am tired and I want to sleep. I think about the major in the gymnasium with the IV in her arm. I think about the moment when she made the decision to treat herself. I think about whether she did it last, after she had treated everyone else, or whether she had a colleague who treated her, or whether she set up the IV on herself, calmly, with the practiced motions of someone who had done it 1,000 times. I think about whether she was afraid. I think about whether she was relieved. I think about whether she knew, in the last few seconds, that the system she had built had failed, or whether she still believed that what she was doing was the right thing. I think she believed it. I think she had to believe it, because the alternative was unbearable. I think she made the decision the same way I made my decisions, by looking at the evidence she had and constructing the best explanation she could and acting on it, because the cost of not acting was higher than the cost of acting on incomplete information. I think she did the best she could with what she knew. I think she was wrong, and I think she was brave, and I think those two things are not in contradiction. I am going to stop driving in a few days. I've been thinking about a place. There's a small lake in the northern part of the state I am in with a cabin on it that belongs to a man I worked with for 6 years before I lost track of him. He is probably not there. He is probably dead. The cabin has a wood stove and a hand pump and a small garden, and I think I can survive there for a while, and I think I can be alone there in a way that does not require me to make any more decisions about systems built by other people. I am going to drive there tomorrow. I am going to verify it from a distance before I commit. I am going to watch it for a full day before I approach it. I have learned that much, at least. If I get there, and if it is empty, and if I am still not symptomatic in another 2 weeks, I am going to consider the possibility that I might live. I am not going to commit to that possibility. I am going to hold it loosely, the way I should have held the possibility that the shelter was safe. I am going to keep asking every day what assumptions I am making, and whether those assumptions still hold. I am going to keep reading the silences, the way I learned to read the silences in shipping manifests 11 years ago, when my biggest worry was whether a child in another city would have her insulin on time. I think about that child sometimes. I never met her. She was an abstraction in a database, a row in a spreadsheet, a number that needed to be matched to another number. But I think about her. I think about whether she got her insulin in the days after the outbreak began. I think about whether the system I helped build held together long enough to keep her alive for 1 more week, 2 more weeks, a month. I think about whether somewhere there is a mother who is grateful that her daughter had insulin on the day everything fell apart, and who does not know that the reason her daughter had insulin was a man like me, sitting at a desk 1,100 miles away, reading silences in a manifest. I would like to believe that. I do not know if it is true. I do not know if any of the systems I helped build are still working, or if they all failed the way the shelter failed, in ways that the people inside them could not see until it was too late. I do not know if the work I did mattered, or if it was always going to be erased by something larger that none of us were equipped to imagine. But I know this. The major in the gymnasium did her best. The people who built the shelter did their best. The driver of the pickup outside Cloquet, the one I stepped over to siphon his gasoline, was doing his best. We were all doing our best, with the information we had, against a thing that was indifferent to our best. Some of us got lucky. Most of us did not. The line between those two outcomes was, in many cases, not a difference in skill or judgment or virtue. It was a difference in which assumption happened to be the one that broke. I am still driving north. The road is empty, and the sky is the color of an old bruise, and the radio is silent on every frequency I have tried. I have a 1/4 tank of gas, and a destination I have not verified, and a cough that started this morning that is probably from the cold air and probably nothing else. I am going to keep driving until I get to the lake. I am going to verify the cabin from a distance. I am going to be careful. I am going to keep asking the right questions, the ones about what I cannot see, instead of the ones about what I can. If you are listening to this, you are doing the same thing. You are alive because you have been asking the right questions, or because you have been lucky, or because of some combination of the two. I hope, for your sake, that it is more the first than the second. I hope you get to a place where the questions you ask are the ones that match the threats you face. I hope the assumptions you are making are the ones that still hold. The cough is probably nothing. The lake is probably empty. The cabin is probably standing. I am probably going to make it through the night, and the next night, and enough nights after that to reach a point where I can stop driving and start something that looks, from a distance, like a life. Probably. I have learned to hold that word loosely. I am going to keep holding it loosely for as long as I have left to hold anything at all.